Don't say that name, Marcus Hale said, low and sharp, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to take control of a room. But Aaliyah Brooks had already said it, and now the silence that followed felt heavier than anything money could buy, heavier than the crystal glasses, the polished marble floors, the quiet hum of a Manhattan restaurant where a single dinner bill could run $5,000 without anyone blinking. Because this wasn't just silence, this was recognition trying to claw its way to the surface. And Aaliyah stood there in her black uniform, tray still balanced in one hand, her posture straight, but her heartbeat loud in her ears, her eyes fixed on the tattoo wrapped around Marcus's forearm like it had been waiting for her all these years. My father had that exact tattoo, she repeated, softer this time, not to challenge them, not to impress anyone, but because something inside her refused to let the moment pass. And across the table, one of the other seals let out a quiet breath, the kind that barely made a sound but shifted everything, while Ethan Cole, billionaire, owner of half the skyline visible through the glass walls, leaned back in his chair with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. You're mistaken, he said, casual, dismissive, like he'd said those words 1,000 times before to people who didn't belong in his world. Why don't you bring the check instead? But Aaliyah didn't move. Not this time, not when every instinct told her that walking away would mean losing something she didn't even fully understand yet, because she had seen that tattoo before, not in a picture, not in a movie, but in real life, in a small apartment that smelled like coffee and old books, on a man who used to kneel down to her height and tell her stories about oceans and distances measured in miles she couldn't yet imagine, a man who had left one night without saying goodbye, leaving behind only fragments, a memory, a feeling, and that mark. Always that mark, inked in black and faded blue, with a tiny number hidden just beneath the curve, a number no one ever noticed unless they knew where to look. And now her voice found it again, steady, precise. There's a number under the lower edge, right here, she said, gesturing just enough to show she knew without touching. Most people miss it, but it's there. And that was the moment everything shifted, because Marcus Hale didn't speak right away. He didn't correct her, didn't dismiss her. Instead, his jaw tightened just slightly, the muscle flickering like a crack in something carefully controlled. And the other men at the table exchanged glances that lasted less than a second, but said more than words ever could, because what she had just described wasn't public, wasn't something you could find online or overhear in a bar. It was buried, classified, locked behind layers of silence and memory. And for the first time since she had spoken, Ethan Cole stopped smiling. The room still elegant, still polished, still filled with quiet music and low conversation. But now something else was there too. Something invisible but undeniable, like the air before a storm. And Aaliyah could feel it pressing in, could feel every eye that mattered turning toward her, weighing her, measuring her. And yet she didn't shrink, didn't apologize, because this wasn't about proving herself. It wasn't about stepping out of line. It was about something deeper, something older, something that connected a girl who had been told her whole life to stay in her place with a group of men who had built their identities on control, discipline, and secrets. And Marcus finally leaned forward, his gaze no longer distant, no longer guarded in the same way, but searching now. Careful, almost reluctant. Who was your father? He asked, each word deliberate, like he wasn't just asking a question, but opening a door he wasn't sure should be opened. And Aaliyah felt the weight of it, felt the years between who she had been and who she was now collapsing into this single moment, because she had asked herself that same question more times than she could count, in quiet nights and early mornings, in moments when the world felt too big and she felt too small. But now, standing there in a room built for power she didn't have, she realized something had changed, because for the first time, it wasn't just her asking, it was them. And whatever answer she gave next wasn't just going to fill a silence. It was going to rewrite everything they thought they knew. The question hung in the air like something fragile, something that could shatter if handled the wrong way. And for a brief second, Aaliyah Brooks felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her, measuring her worth, her truth, her place. But this time she did not look down. She did not retreat into the quiet space she had learned to survive in. Instead, she took a slow breath, steadying herself, because this was no longer just about a memory. This was about a connection that refused to stay buried. His name was Daniel Brooks, she said, each word clear, deliberate, and something in the way Marcus Hale reacted was almost invisible to anyone who was not looking closely. A slight pause, a tightening around the eyes, the kind of reaction trained men could hide from the world, but not entirely from themselves. And around him the other Navy SEALs shifted just enough to signal recognition, not confirmation yet, but something close to it, while Ethan Cole leaned forward again, his earlier confidence replaced with something sharper, more cautious. Because this was no longer a simple interruption, this was something he could not immediately control, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. There are a lot of people with that name, Ethan said, his tone smooth but edged, trying to pull the moment back into something manageable, something dismissible. But Aaliyah shook her head slightly, not in defiance, but in certainty, the kind that came from holding on to a memory for years without ever knowing why it mattered so much. He used to tell me stories, she continued, her voice softer now, but no less steady. About long nights, about watching the horizon, about a team that never left anyone behind, even when it would have been easier to walk away. And Marcus's gaze did not leave her face, not even for a second, because those words were not random, they were not guesses, they were echoes, fragments of something that belonged to a world very few people ever saw. A world built on trust and silence and things that were never written down, and the room around them seemed to fade. The clinking glasses, the quiet music, the low conversations all dissolving into the background as the tension at that table tightened like a wire pulled too far. And Aaliyah could feel her hands trembling slightly now, not from fear, but from the realization that she was standing at the edge of something much bigger than herself, something that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for this exact moment to surface. He had a phrase, she added, almost as if she was speaking more to herself than to them. He said it every time he thought I was not listening, every time he thought I was too young to understand. And one of the SEALs shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, because now it was no longer just a possibility, now it was becoming something undeniable, something that reached past coincidence into something deeper, something real. And Marcus finally spoke again, his voice lower now, less controlled. What phrase? He asked, and there was no impatience in it, no dismissal, only a quiet intensity that made it clear that whatever came next mattered more than anything else in that room. And Aaliyah closed her eyes for just a fraction of a second, not to escape, but to remember, to reach back into a moment that had never fully left her. A small apartment, dim light, the sound of distant traffic, and a voice that had always felt safe even when the world outside was not. He said. She began, opening her eyes again, meeting Marcus's gaze without hesitation. We do not disappear, we just move where we are needed most. And this time the reaction was not subtle, it was immediate, it was visible, it was real, because Marcus leaned back slightly as if something had just struck him, not physically, but in a place much deeper, a place built on years of discipline and memory and things he had long since locked away. And the others at the table exchanged looks that no longer tried to hide what they were thinking, because that phrase was not just a phrase, it was a code, a quiet promise spoken only among those who had earned it, a reminder of something that had been lost, or at least believed to be lost. And Ethan Cole, for the first time since the moment began, said nothing at all, because even he could see that whatever this was, it was no longer his to control. And Aaliyah stood there, her uniform the same, her position unchanged, and yet everything about the way the room saw her had shifted, because she was no longer just someone passing through their world unnoticed. She was now the center of something they could not ignore, something they could not explain away. And Marcus's voice, when it came again, was quieter than before, but carried a weight that had not been there at the start. That phrase was never written down, he said slowly, almost to himself. It was never shared outside the team. And his eyes returned to hers, searching, questioning, but also something else now, something closer to respect, or maybe even something deeper, something that had not been present when she first spoke. And in that moment the question was no longer whether she knew something she should not know. The question was how far that truth really went, and what it meant for everything they thought they had left behind. Then you knew him, Aaliyah said quietly, not as a question but as a realization, and the words landed differently this time, not light, not uncertain, but anchored in something deeper, something that had been building from the moment she first spoke. And Marcus Hale did not answer right away, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was looking past her, past the restaurant, past the present moment, and into a memory he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "We knew a man by that name," he said carefully, each word chosen with precision. "But he is gone." And there it was, the line they had all been trained to hold, the version of the truth that was safe, contained, finished. But Aaliyah felt something inside her resist that finality, because nothing about this felt finished. Nothing about this felt like a story that had ended the way it was supposed to. And she shook her head slightly, not out of disrespect, but because her memories refused to match the simplicity of that statement. "He was not gone when I last saw him," she said, her voice steady even as her heart began to race. "He left, but he promised he would come back." And one of the seals at the table shifted again, this time more noticeably, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still, because promises like that were not given lightly, not in their world, not by someone who understood what it meant to say those words. And Ethan Cole exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin, his control slipping in small, almost invisible ways. "This is not the place for stories," he said, his tone sharper now, trying to pull the moment back into something manageable, something he could define and end. But Marcus raised a hand slightly, not even looking at Ethan, and that small gesture was enough to silence him completely, because whatever this was, it had moved beyond business, beyond image, into something far more personal, far more complicated. And Aaliyah noticed it, the shift in power, subtle but undeniable. The way the man who owned the room just moments ago was now waiting, watching, no longer in control of the narrative. And Marcus leaned forward again, his attention fully on her now. "When did you last see him?" he asked, and this time there was no distance in his voice, only focus. And Aaliyah swallowed gently, her mind reaching back through years of ordinary days that suddenly felt like they had been leading here all along. "I was 8, she said. "It was late, maybe around 10 at night. I remember because the streetlights were on and the apartment felt quieter than usual, like even the walls were listening." And as she spoke, the room seemed to follow her into that memory, the present fading just enough for the past to take shape. He packed a small bag, nothing like a trip, more like he did not want to draw attention, and he knelt down in front of me and told me to be strong, told me that sometimes doing the right thing means leaving before anyone understands why. And Marcus's expression tightened again, because those words were not random either. They were familiar in a way that made them impossible to ignore. And Aaliyah continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "I asked him when he would come back, and he smiled, not like he was lying, but like he believed it himself. And he said, 'Sooner than you think.'" And the silence that followed was different now, heavier, more deliberate, because that was not the kind of promise a man like that would break without reason. And Marcus's hand rested against the table, his fingers still, his posture controlled. But there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before, something closer to doubt, or maybe something closer to realization. And one of the other seals finally spoke, his voice low, careful. "We were told there were no survivors," he said, not looking at Aaliyah, but at Marcus, as if seeking confirmation. And Marcus did not respond immediately, because confirmation would mean accepting that something in their past had not been what they believed, that something had been hidden, altered, or left unfinished. And Aaliyah felt it then, the shift not just in the room, but in the story itself, because this was no longer about whether her father existed in their world. It was about what had really happened to him, and why the truth had been buried. And she took a small step forward, not to challenge them, but because something inside her was guiding her now, something stronger than doubt, stronger than fear. "He left me one thing," she said, her voice just above a whisper, but carrying clearly across the table. And every eye turned to her again, drawn by the weight of those words, because in a world built on silence, anything left behind mattered. Anything preserved carried meaning. And Marcus's gaze sharpened once more. "What did he leave?" he asked. And this time there was no hesitation, no distance, only a quiet urgency that revealed more than he intended. And Aaliyah held his gaze, steady, grounded, as if she had been preparing for this moment without ever knowing it. And the answer she was about to give was not just a detail, not just a memory, but something that had the power to unravel everything they thought they knew. "He left me a coin," Aaliyah said, and for a moment the words seemed too simple to carry the weight that had been building, too ordinary for something that had pulled a room full of powerful men into silence. But she did not look away, did not soften the statement, because she knew what that coin meant even if they did not yet. And Marcus Hale's expression did not change immediately, but his eyes narrowed just enough to show that the word had landed somewhere deeper than expected, because in his world nothing was ever just a coin, nothing was ever just a keepsake. And the others at the table leaned in slightly, their attention sharpening in quiet unison. "It is not valuable," Aaliyah continued, her voice steady. "Not the way people usually think. It is not gold. It is not something you would notice unless you were looking for it. But he told me never to lose it, not for anything." And as she spoke, she set the tray down slowly on the edge of the table, her hands now free, her movements calm but deliberate, because this was not something to rush, not something to reveal without understanding the moment it would create. And Ethan Cole watched closely now, no longer interrupting, no longer dismissing, because even he could feel that whatever she was about to show them had already shifted the balance in ways he could not explain. And Aaliyah reached into the small pocket of her uniform, fingers brushing against something smooth and worn, something she had carried with her for years without fully knowing why it mattered so much. And when she pulled it out, it caught the light just enough to draw every eye in the room. A simple coin, slightly faded, edges softened by time. But there was something about it, something in the way it seemed to hold its own quiet gravity. And she placed it gently on the table between them, not sliding it forward, not offering it like a transaction, but setting it down like a truth that had always been there waiting to be seen. And for a second no one moved, no one spoke, because recognition does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with stillness, with a shift so subtle that it feels like the world itself is pausing to take notice. And Marcus's gaze dropped to the coin, his focus tightening as he leaned closer, not hurried, not careless, but precise. Like a man who understood that small details often carried the greatest meaning, and his hand hovered above it for just a fraction of a second before he picked it up, turning it slightly so the light revealed what had been hidden in plain sight. And that was when everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. Because etched into the surface of that coin was a symbol, one that had never been meant for public eyes, one that existed only among a small group of people who understood its weight, its history, its purpose. And Marcus's fingers tightened ever so slightly around it, not in possession, but in recognition. And one of the seals beside him leaned in closer, his breath catching just enough to betray what he was seeing. "That is not possible," he said quietly, not as a challenge, but as a reaction, because this was not something that could be guessed, not something that could be recreated. It was specific, intentional, and deeply personal. And Aaliyah watched them carefully, not with triumph, not with expectation, but with a quiet certainty that had been growing stronger with every second, because she had lived with this piece of the past her entire life, even when no one else seemed to understand what it meant. And now she was watching as that meaning unfolded in real time. And Marcus finally looked up at her again, his expression no longer guarded in the same way, no longer distant, but searching, almost unsettled. "Where did you get this?" he asked, though the answer was already beginning to form in his mind, already connecting with pieces he had not allowed himself to revisit. And Aaliyah met his gaze without hesitation. "He gave it to me the night he left," she said. "He told me if I ever met someone who recognized it, I should listen to what they say, because they would know the truth." And that word hung there, truth, heavier than anything else that had been spoken, because truth in their world was not simple. It was layered, protected, sometimes even hidden for reasons that only made sense to those who carried it. And Marcus looked back down at the coin, turning it once more in his hand, his mind moving through memories, through missions, through moments that had been filed away as complete, as finished, as closed. And yet here it was, a piece of that past sitting in front of him, undeniable, impossible to ignore. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but carried something new, something that had not been there at the beginning of this night. We gave this coin to one man, he said slowly, each word deliberate. Only one. And the others at the table went still again, because they all knew what that meant. They all understood the weight of that statement. And Marcus's eyes lifted to meet Aaliyah's once more, no longer questioning whether she belonged in this moment, but trying to understand how far it truly reached. And for the first time since she had spoken, there was something in his expression that looked like respect, mixed with something else, something closer to uncertainty, because if what she was showing them was real, then the story they had believed for years was not complete, and whatever came next was going to change more than just this conversation. Then he was not supposed to be forgotten, Aaliyah said, her voice quiet, but carrying a clarity that cut through every unspoken assumption in the room. And Marcus Hale did not respond immediately because the weight of that statement pressed against something he had not questioned in years, something he had accepted as finished, filed away, and sealed under orders that were never meant to be reopened. Yet here it was, sitting in his hand in the form of a worn coin that should not exist outside of memory, and the men beside him were no longer hiding their reactions, their posture shifting, their eyes locked on the small object as if it might change if they looked away. While Ethan Cole remained still, watching the exchange unfold with a growing sense of unease, because this was no longer a conversation he could guide or control, and Aaliyah stood there, steady, grounded, not because she understood everything, but because she understood enough to know that this moment mattered, that it was revealing something larger than any one of them. And Marcus finally exhaled slowly, his grip loosening slightly on the coin as if acknowledging that whatever this was, it was no longer his to contain. That coin was issued after a mission that never made it into any official report, he said, his voice low, measured, but no longer distant. It was given to a man who made a decision that changed everything for us. And he paused, not for effect, but because the memory itself demanded it, because some stories do not fade, they wait. And Aaliyah listened closely, her focus unwavering, because this was the first time anyone had spoken about her father in a way that felt real, in a way that connected the fragments she had carried all her life into something whole. And Marcus continued, "We were told that he did not make it back." And the words felt different now, less certain, less final, because the evidence in his hand contradicted them in a way he could not ignore. And one of the seals leaned forward, his voice quieter than before, almost cautious. "If she has the coin, then someone had to give it to him after," he said, not looking at Aaliyah, but at Marcus, because the implication was clear, something about their understanding of that mission was incomplete, and Marcus nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the possibility, the kind that shifts everything once it enters the room. And Ethan Cole finally spoke. Again, his tone controlled but edged with impatience. "You are letting a story from a waitress rewrite facts that were established years ago," he said. And for a moment the words seemed to pull the room back towards something familiar, something structured. But Marcus did not look at him this time, did not respond to the challenge, because what was happening here was not about status or authority, it was about truth. And truth does not always follow the rules people set for it. And Aaliyah felt that shift again, deeper now, stronger, because she was no longer being tolerated, she was being heard, and that difference changed everything. "He told me something else," she said, her voice steady, and the room responded instantly, every eye returning to her, every movement pausing, because now they understood that each piece she revealed carried weight, carried meaning they could not dismiss. And Marcus's gaze locked onto hers again, focused, intent. "What did he say?" he asked, and there was no impatience in his voice, only a quiet urgency that revealed just how much this mattered. And Aaliyah took a small breath, not to gather courage, but to steady the memory as it surfaced, clear and unshaken by time. "He said if anyone ever tells you the story is over, they are protecting something, not ending it," she said. And the words settled into the space between them with a force that was impossible to ignore. Because that was not just a phrase, it was a warning, a message meant to outlast the moment it was spoken. And Marcus's expression changed again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that something inside him had shifted, something that had been locked away was now being reconsidered, re-examined. And the others at the table felt it too, the quiet unraveling of certainty, the realization that what they had believed might not be the full story. And Ethan Cole leaned back slightly, his confidence no longer as steady as it had been at the beginning of the night. Because this was no longer about a simple interruption, it was about a truth that refused to stay buried. And Aaliyah stood there, no longer just a presence moving through the background, but the center of something that had begun long before this night, and was only now coming into focus. And Marcus looked down at the coin one more time before closing his hand around it gently, not to hide it, but to hold on to the reality it represented. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a new weight, one that acknowledged not just the past, but the possibility that the past had never truly been finished. If what you are saying is true, he said slowly, then the story we were given was not the truth, it was a version of it. And his eyes lifted to meet hers once more, steady, searching, and now something else, something closer to respect, because the power in this moment no longer belonged to the men who had entered the room with authority. It belonged to the one person who had nothing but a memory and the courage to speak it. And that shift, quiet as it was, changed everything. Then someone wanted it buried, Aaliyah said. And this time her voice carried something new, not just memory, not just certainty, but a quiet understanding that had begun to take shape in front of all of them. And Marcus Hale did not interrupt, did not correct her, because the idea had already formed in his own mind, unspoken but undeniable, that what they had accepted as truth might have been constructed, shaped, and sealed for reasons that went beyond what they were told. And the men around him sat in a silence that no longer felt controlled, no longer felt disciplined, but uncertain, like something carefully built was beginning to show cracks. And Ethan Cole shifted in his seat, the movement small but noticeable, because for the first time that evening, he was no longer the center of attention, no longer the one guiding the outcome. And that loss of control unsettled him in ways he could not easily mask. While Aaliyah stood there with nothing but her voice and a memory, yet somehow holding more weight in that moment than anyone else in the room. And Marcus slowly opened his hand again, looking down at the coin as if seeing it for the first time, not as an object, but as evidence, as a piece of something unfinished. There was a report, he said finally, his tone quieter now, less certain. It said the mission ended with no survivors beyond the team, that anyone connected to it was accounted for. And he paused, not because he did not remember, but because he remembered too well. Because now every word of that report felt incomplete. But reports are written by people, Aaliyah said gently, and that simple statement carried more truth than any official document ever could, because it reminded them that even facts could be shaped, that even records could leave things out. And Marcus nodded slowly, the motion almost reluctant, because acknowledging that meant questioning everything that came after, everything that had been built on that version of events. And one of the seals leaned back slightly, running a hand over his jaw as if trying to piece something together. If he made it out, he said carefully. If he survived long enough to pass this on, then he chose not to come back. And the implication hung there, heavy and complicated, because it suggested something that did not fit the man they remembered, the man they trusted. And Aaliyah felt that shift immediately, the way the narrative tried to move in a direction that explained the unknown by assigning distance, by suggesting choice. And she shook her head, not forcefully, but with quiet conviction. He did not leave us, she said, and the certainty in her voice made it impossible to dismiss. He was trying to protect something. And Marcus's eyes lifted sharply at that, because those words aligned too closely with what he knew, with what he had experienced, with the kind of decisions that were made when the stakes were not just personal, but far beyond that. And Ethan Cole let out a slow breath, his patience thinning again. You are building a story out of fragments, he said, his tone controlled but strained. This is not evidence. This is interpretation. But no one responded to him this time. Not Marcus, not the others, because the conversation had moved beyond the need for validation from someone outside of it. And Aaliyah could feel it, the shift in who was being listened to, who was being trusted. And Marcus leaned forward again, his posture no longer rigid, no longer purely controlled, but engaged, invested. What else did he tell you? He asked, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, something closer to hope, or maybe something closer to the need for answers he had not realized he was still searching for. And Aaliyah closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to gather the pieces of a memory that had once seemed small, ordinary, but now carried a weight she could finally understand. He said there are things people will protect even if it costs them everything, she said slowly. And if you ever find yourself standing in the middle of a story that does not make sense, it is because you are only seeing the part they want you to see. And the words settled into the room like a quiet revelation, because they did not just explain the past, they challenged the present. They asked a question that none of them had considered asking before, and Marcus felt it, the shift from doubt to possibility, from certainty to reconsideration, and he looked at the men beside him, seeing the same realization reflected back, the same understanding that something had been left out, something important, something that connected the man they lost to the woman standing in front of them now. And for the first time since this began, Marcus spoke not as someone recalling the past, but as someone ready to question it. If he was protecting something, he said slowly, then we need to know what it was. And his gaze returned to Aaliyah, steady, focused, no longer questioning whether she belonged in this moment, but recognizing that she was the reason it existed at all. And in that quiet exchange, without raised voices or dramatic gestures, the balance of power shifted once more, not back to what it had been, but into something entirely new. Something built not on rank or wealth, but on truth waiting to be uncovered. Then you already know where to look, Aaliyah said, and the words landed with a quiet precision that made Marcus Hale still for a moment longer than expected, because it was not just what she said, it was how she said it, like someone who had not just remembered something, but finally understood it, and the room seemed to lean into that understanding, the silence no longer uncertain but focused, as if every person at that table had stepped into the same realization at the same time, and Marcus's gaze sharpened slightly, not defensive, not dismissive, but attentive in a way that revealed he was no longer leading this moment. He was following it. What do you mean? He asked, and there was no edge in his voice now, only intent, because whatever came next mattered, and Aaliyah did not hesitate, not because she had planned this, but because the pieces were finally aligning in her mind. He did not leave me instructions to find people, she said slowly. He left me something so people could find the truth themselves. And Marcus's hand tightened slightly around the coin again, his eyes dropping to it, as if it might reveal more than it already had, and for a second the weight of everything unsaid pressed into the space between them, because this was no longer about what had happened, it was about why it had been hidden, and the difference between those two things was everything. And one of the seals leaned forward, his voice quieter now, more measured. If that coin was meant to lead somewhere, then it is not just a symbol, he said, thinking out loud. It is a key. And that word shifted the entire tone of the conversation. Because a symbol could be remembered, honored, even forgotten, but a key implied access, something locked, something hidden, something waiting, and Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, because he understood that distinction better than anyone, and Ethan Cole exhaled again, slower this time, watching as the conversation moved further away from him, from anything he could influence. And Aaliyah saw it, not as a victory, but as a quiet truth. That power in a room could change without anyone raising their voice, and she took a small step closer to the table, not intruding, but no longer standing at the edge of it either, because she was part of this now in a way that could not be undone. He used to turn it, she said, her voice softer, almost reflective, like this, and she gestured gently, her fingers mimicking a small rotation, precise, controlled, and Marcus's head lifted immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as if something had just clicked into place, because that movement was not random, it was specific, deliberate, something tied to a system, a method, something trained, and the seal beside him reacted the same way, his posture straightening as recognition spread across his face. That is not just a habit, he said under his breath. That is a sequence, and the word carried weight. Because in their world sequences were not casual, they were intentional. They unlocked things, they revealed things, they connected points that did not make sense on their own. And Marcus looked back at the coin, turning it slowly between his fingers, not randomly now, but with purpose, testing something, following a pattern only he could see. And the room seemed to hold its breath as he did, the quiet tension building again. But this time it was different, not uncertain, not reactive, but expectant, like something was about to be uncovered, and Aaliyah watched him closely, her heart steady now, because for the first time she was not just remembering. She was witnessing the meaning of those memories unfold in real time. And Marcus stopped suddenly, his hand still, his eyes fixed on a point on the coin that had not been visible before. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than it had been all night, but carried a clarity that cut through everything else. "There is a marking here," he said, almost to himself. "It is not decorative, it is directional." And the others leaned in closer, their focus tightening as the realization spread, because if that was true, then the coin was never meant to be kept hidden, it was meant to be used. And Aaliyah felt a quiet shift inside her, something settling into place, because all those years of holding on to something she did not fully understand were leading here, to this moment, to this revelation. And Marcus looked up at her again, not with doubt, not with distance, but with something entirely different now, something closer to recognition, not just of who she was, but of what she carried. "Your father did not leave you a memory," he said slowly. "He left you a path." And the words changed everything, because a memory could be honored, but a path had to be followed. And for the first time since this began, the question was no longer about the past. It was about what came next, and whether they were willing to see it through. "Then we are already late," Marcus Hale said quietly, and the weight of that realization settled over the table like something undeniable, something that could not be ignored any longer, because if the coin was a path, then it was never meant to sit still for years, it was meant to be followed immediately. And the fact that it had not been meant something had been delayed, or, worse, something had been intentionally paused, and Aaliyah felt that shift in him. The moment he stopped looking at the past as something finished and started seeing it as something interrupted, and she held his gaze without hesitation, because for the first time since she spoke, she was not the only one carrying the urgency of it. "He trusted someone to understand it," she said, her voice steady. "Maybe not right away, but eventually." And Marcus nodded slowly, because that made sense in a way nothing else had yet, a plan that did not depend on time, but on the right moment, the right person, the right connection. And one of the seals leaned forward again, his tone sharper now, more focused. "If this is a sequence, then it is not just about the coin itself. It is about where it leads when used correctly." And Marcus turned the coin once more, carefully, deliberately, following the motion Aaliyah had shown, aligning each detail with precision. And then he stopped again, his eyes narrowing slightly as if something had finally revealed itself fully. "There is a set of coordinates hidden in the pattern," he said, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, only clarity, and the words sent a quiet ripple through the group, because coordinates meant a place, a real location, something tangible, something that existed beyond memory or speculation. And Ethan Cole shifted again, his composure tightening as he realized how far this had gone, how far beyond his control it had moved. "Coordinates to what?" he asked, his tone measured but edged, as if trying to reclaim some ground. But Marcus did not look at him this time, did not give him the response he expected, because his focus was entirely on what had just been uncovered. And Aaliyah watched as the men around the table leaned closer, their attention no longer divided, no longer skeptical, but fully engaged. And in that moment she understood something she had not before, that this was never just about her father being remembered. It was about something he had chosen to protect even after he was gone, something that required the right people to come together before it could be revealed. And Marcus placed the coin carefully on the table, not as something finished, but as something activated, something that had finally done what it was meant to do. "We need to verify it," one of the seals said, already reaching for his phone, but Marcus raised a hand slightly, not to stop him, but to slow the moment down just enough. "We do this right," he said, his voice firm but calm. "No assumptions, no rushing." Because he understood what was at stake now, not just the truth, but the consequences of uncovering it without understanding it fully. And Aaliyah felt a quiet respect in that, because it was the same kind of careful thinking her father had always shown, the same balance between action and restraint. And Ethan Cole leaned back slightly, watching them with a look that was harder to read now, less confident, more calculating. "You are about to chase something based on a story," he said, but even he seemed to hear the weakness in that argument, because the room no longer responded to him the way it had before. And Marcus finally looked at him, not with irritation, not with dismissal, but with a calm certainty that made the difference between them clear. "No," he said. "We are about to follow something that was left behind with intention." And that distinction mattered, because intention implied purpose, and purpose implied meaning. And Aaliyah felt that meaning settle deeper within her, because whatever her father had set in motion, it had not been random, it had been precise, deliberate, something built to last until the right moment arrived, and now that moment was here, unfolding in front of them. And one of the SEALs looked at Marcus again, his expression steady. "Ready? If those coordinates are real, then we need to move," he said. And Marcus nodded once, not as a command, but as an agreement, a shared understanding that this was no longer a conversation. It was the beginning of something else, something that extended beyond the walls of this room. And Aaliyah took a slow breath, her eyes moving from the coin to the men around the table, to the shifting energy that had transformed from doubt to purpose. And for the first time she allowed herself to feel something close to certainty, not about what they would find, but about the fact that they were finally asking the right questions. And Marcus reached for the coin again, closing his hand around it with a steadiness that had returned, not as control, but as resolve. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that resolve clearly. "If your father left this for a reason," he said, looking directly at Aaliyah, "then we are going to find out what that reason was." And in that moment the path that had once been hidden became something real, something chosen, something that all of them were now part of whether they had expected it or not. And the quiet tension that followed was no longer uncertainty, but anticipation. Because whatever waited at the end of those coordinates was no longer just a mystery. It was a truth that had been waiting long enough. "We leave now," Marcus Hale said. And there was no hesitation left in his voice, no trace of the uncertainty that had filled the room just minutes earlier. Because once a path revealed itself, standing still was no longer an option. And the men around the table understood that without needing further explanation, their movements subtle but decisive as they shifted from conversation into action. And Aaliyah stood there for a brief second, watching the transformation unfold, realizing that something that had lived quietly inside her for years had just set all of this in motion. Something her father had trusted would one day matter, and now it did, more than she could have ever imagined. And Marcus turned toward her, not as a man addressing a stranger, but as someone acknowledging a partner in what came next. "You are coming with us," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition of her place in this. And Aaliyah nodded once, steady and certain, because there was no part of her that wanted to step away from this now. Not when she had finally reached the edge of the truth she had been holding onto without understanding. And Ethan Cole remained seated for a moment longer than the others, his eyes following them, calculating, measuring, as if trying to decide whether to step back or step in. But the room had already moved beyond him, and when he finally stood, it was with a controlled calm that no longer carried authority, only presence. And outside the city air felt different, sharper, like the world had shifted slightly without anyone noticing. And Marcus walked with purpose, the coin still in his hand, his mind already mapping the coordinates, aligning them with places he knew, places he had not thought about in years. And one of the SEALs spoke quietly beside him, confirming the numbers, double-checking the sequence, ensuring that what they had found was not just possible, but precise. And Aaliyah listened as they spoke, not lost, not out of place, but absorbing it, because this was the language her father had lived in, the way he had thought, structured, prepared, and for the first time she felt like she was stepping into that world instead of standing outside of it. And Marcus slowed slightly as they reached the vehicles, turning back toward her for just a moment. "Once we go there," he said, his voice lower now, more personal, "there is no going back to not knowing." And the statement was not a warning, but a truth, a simple acknowledgement that some answers changed everything. And Aaliyah met his gaze without hesitation, because she had already crossed that line the moment she spoke up, the moment she chose to share what she knew instead of keeping it quiet. "I have been living with not knowing my whole life," she said, her voice calm but grounded. "I am ready for the rest of it." And something in that answer settled whatever final doubt might have remained, because it was not driven by curiosity, but by resolve. And Marcus nodded once, opening the door as the others moved into position, their coordination natural, unspoken, like something that had never truly faded. And as the engine started, the quiet hum filling the space, Aaliyah glanced down at the coin one last time before Marcus closed his hand around it again, because now it was no longer just an object from her past. It was a guide into something larger, something hidden for years, something her father had chosen to leave behind. Instead of take with him, and the city lights blurred slightly as they began to move, the distance between what was known and what was waiting shrinking with every passing second, and inside that motion, inside that forward momentum, there was a quiet realization that none of them spoke out loud, but all of them felt that this was never just about a memory, never just about a story. It was about a truth that had been carefully protected until the right moment, the right people, the right connection brought it back into the light. And as the road stretched ahead, carrying them toward coordinates that had waited long enough, one question remained, unspoken but impossible to ignore, not just what they would find when they got there, but why it had been worth hiding for so long. And in that question, in that quiet tension between past and future, the real story was only just beginning.